Good evening, welcome to episode 24 of Magic the Judging, my fifth episode. My name is David Smith, and tonight we are going to be talking all about Modern. I myself judged a Modern Grand Prix trial at the weekend, and of course, in Seattle, Pro Tour Return to Ravnica happened, so that's why we're going to be taking on the topic of Modern. However, just want to quickly talk about, first of all, any kind of clean-up housekeeping stuff from last week's episode talking about mana cost. There really isn't that much to say on this one. I think everybody followed along the topic. I haven't had any comments. So that's all we had to talk about on the topic of mana cost. I also wanted to just remind you, if you are watching this from outside of the United Kingdom, British summertime is ending this weekend. What this means is that we're going to be having our clocks go back 1 hour. If you've got summertime yourself, or daylight savings as you might call it, and it's not synced up with ours, that's something to bear in mind, because I'm going to be broadcasting at 7 p.m. next Thursday, just like usual, but it might not be the same time for you. So do keep an eye on your clocks, and if you come to join us next week. So let's get on to Modern. I'm going to start by talking about my Grand Prix trial at the weekend, and then also looking over the format more generally. Modern is a format that was invented by Wizards basically because they wanted to have a non-rotating format like Vintage and Legacy that was more accessible. Because of the existence of the reserve list, a list of cards which Wizards has promised never to reprint, they are very much stymied in their ability to support Legacy and Vintage with reprints of its most important cards, such as the dual lands and other staples. Because they can't reprint those cards, the formats unfortunately are very expensive and are likely to continue getting more expensive, possibly forever. And they wanted to introduce a non-rotating format that would let people play their older cards and that wouldn't suffer from that problem. And as a result, the result of which is Modern. The cut-off point for Modern is 8th edition, which is the point when the quote-unquote new card frames were introduced. I say new because they are over 10 years old and have existed for more of Magic than not. And that is the format we're going to be looking at today. So Grand Prix trial of the weekend, we ended up with a total of 15 players for this event. Something I think actually a lot of people when judging Grand Prix trials don't realise is that the number of rounds is not calculated as it is necessarily for larger events, particularly medium-ish and small Grand Prix trials. Might be different to what you expect, and in particular is different whether you're doing sealed deck or constructed. So, for example, for constructed events, if you're running an event with between 9 and 16 players, which a lot of Grand Prix trials fall into that period, in sealed deck you would be running 5 rounds and then a cut to top 8 draft. Actually, I mean, beg your pardon, sorry, 4 rounds and a cut to top 8 draft, whereas in constructed you run 5 rounds and then a top 4. The top 4 thing is pretty unusual. Not many events use a top 4, but it is all on the fact sheet. So just I suppose the recommendation is if you're judging a tournament of any kind and you're not sure what to do, look up the fact sheet for that tournament just by Googling Grand Prix trial fact sheet, and you'll find all the information that you need to know. So as I said, 15 players. We had our 5 rounds followed by a cut to top 4. I don't believe any 2 players at the event were playing the same deck. It was an extremely diverse metagame, and everybody had a really good time. I also want to talk a little bit about something we discussed a few weeks ago with Return to Ravnica episode, which is incentivizing players with your tournament structure. For this particular event, of course, the top prize is the 3rd round buy, in this case for Grand Prix Lyon, also a Modern Grand Prix. But we also had booster prizes, and I wanted to set up my tournament structure so that it was incentivizing people to play the way we wanted them to play. So what this meant was I only wanted people in the top 4 if they wanted those buys, and not taking spots in the top 4 from people who didn't want the buys. Therefore, what we did is we awarded the prizes based on Swiss standing only, and allowed people to drop from the tournament after the Swiss was over, still receive their prizes based on their standing in the Swiss, but only advance to the top 4 if they did not drop. And what that means is that we allow people who can't go to the GP, don't want to go to GP, don't need the buys for whatever reason if they have them already, those people are able to drop, still get all the boosters that they won by doing really well in the tournament, and people who do want the buys, who do need the buys, get to play in the top 4. it worked really well. We had two people who weren't able to make it who did drop from the tournament because of that, and therefore all four of our top four players were people who were going to the GP who needed the buy. And I think that's a real good lesson about how you can incentivize people to do the kind of things you want. So let's move on to the event itself. I was very lucky to have no deck registration errors in this event, which is pretty rare. Although for an event this small, it's reassuring that people are capable of doing it. We didn't have all that many penalties, but there were a couple that I think are worth mentioning because they're quite common things that you might expect to see in Modern. This is, of course, a format where fetch lands are and dual lands are the base of most mana bases in the format, and I did have to give one warning for a game rule violation for a player who had fetched a dual land with a fetch land that didn't have the right land types in order to find that dual. It's actually something that's pretty difficult to do. Most decks don't run enough colours that they have duals that are completely off colour for their fetches all that often, and most of the time the decks aren't going to be searching for them. But it can happen, and I just make it a habit that I've trained myself into whenever I'm watching a modern game, whenever I see a fetch land going to the graveyard, just to keep an eye on what land shows up. It's pretty easy because both the Ravnica dual lands and the fetches both have the two-tone text boxes, so you don't even need to sort of look closely at which one. If you're not good at art recognition, you can just spot and make sure that there's a colour overlap between the top card of their graveyard, the fetch land, and whatever land they just put onto the battlefield. An important little thing to keep an eye on, because every so often you will catch people who have not really thought it through and are trying to get a steam vent with a marshland or whatever it might be, and that's what it was in this case. So fairly easy warning there. The other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of penalties for this one was something that you might see at this kind of event more than at other types of competitive events. Grand Prix trials are by their nature the bottom rung of competitive events. They are the least competitive of the competitive events, if that makes sense. And for many people, they are the kind of starting out stepping stone into competitive events. And so there are some things which you may have to watch out for, which at a more high level competitive event you would expect people to know about. And in this case, the issue we had, unfortunately, was one of outside assistance. A father and son pair were both playing in the event. Son was quite young, single digits, and he was very capable. He knew what he was doing. He knew how to play his deck. And his dad was playing as well. They were having a good time generally, but there was a little bit of problem. Generally, when one of them finished, they would go and watch the other's match. On one occasion, the son was kind of blurting out something to the effect of, "Oh, I know what you should do," and his dad was very good about it and said, "Oh no, you can't say it. Just tell me later, son." And on some occasions, the dad was sitting next to his son and trying to kind of help him out with rules, things, and things like that. I tried to make sure that he realized he knew the letter of the law here. That is not a two-headed giant event. That he can't provide anything. And in the final Swiss round in particular, the father had received a bye and was next to his son for the whole round long. And I unfortunately had to keep quite a close ear on him because he kept trying to say things like, "Oh, well, he said something like, for example, there's only one play here," or something like that. Something which isn't explicitly advice, but which is kind of leading a little bit. And I said, "Please don't comment on the match. Don't say anything." I gave him sort of two verbal cautions. Basically, I was being quite generous because I realised he was just trying to help his son here. He's not a competitive player. Neither of them was in a. The son wasn't in a position to get any substantial prizes or make the top four or anything like that. So I wanted to give him as much leeway as possible. Eventually, after two cautions, unfortunately, the father did make some sort of comment about damage and all creatures dying where a Death Touch Worm Coil Engine had been blocked by two blockers, and he said something like, "Oh, well, everything here is dead." Unfortunately, that's why I said, "Look, I know the tournament is over for you. I realise that you've got to buy this round, but I am going to record a match loss penalty against your name in the event to emphasise the point that I have tried to be clear with instructing you, don't comment on matches you're not playing." As he thought, he didn't think it was advice because he thought that that's how Death Touch has to work, where there's two creatures blocking a big Death Touch guy. I explained to him that rules-wise it's not. The Worm Coil Engine player can choose just to kill the first creature in the lineup, whether or not strategically that's a good idea. It is an option. I recorded the penalty. and explained my position to the father, and I think he took it well. But it's something to be aware of these kind of lower level competitive events that maybe you might run into. Final thing on from my Grand Prix trial was just a really neat little rules trick that I noticed. Our winning player, Michael Parker, was playing a blue-red storm deck that used typical kind of rituals and Past in Flames to build up a lethal storm count before then winning with usually grape shot, occasionally empty the warrens. His sideboard strategy involved sideboarding into Pyromancer Ascension as well, in order to be a little bit more disruption resistant. Because he had a lot of redundancy in his deck, he could build up extra spells with Pyromancer Ascension, and then bury his opponent under copied Serum Visions and so forth, and lots of card advantage. There was an interesting situation that occurred when at some point in the finals, his opponent had a Kitchen Finks, and in order to survive, Michael was casting a Grape Shot. He'd only had about 3 or 4 Storm on this Grape Shot, also rather, I should say, only I believe one or two Storm copies, but he also had 2 fully charged Pyromancer Ascensions, giving him 2 extra copies. What he ended up doing was killing the Kitchen Finks and burning his opponent for 1, and then the Kitchen Finks, of course, came back with Persist. And after the match was over, I explained to him that there was a possibility for actually killing the Kitchen Finks as well. The reason why that works is because the Storm trigger and both Pyromancer Ascension triggers, all of which make copies of Grape Shot, all go onto the stack kind of simultaneously. When they are resolving one by one, what happens is that the first of whichever one is on the top will resolve, make a Grape Shot copy, and that will resolve before the next set of copies are made. And what this meant was, but if he used his 2 Pyromancer Ascension copies to kill the Kitchen Finks would then persist, come back to the battlefield before his Storm trigger ever resolved, meaning that when his Storm trigger had resolved, he could then choose the new 2/1 Kitchen Finks at the target, kill that as well, even though it wasn't on the battlefield when the Storm trigger first happened. It's a neat little interaction that I thought was worth sharing, and generally pretty fun. So that's everything I've got from my modern event. I'm just getting up my topic list over on the other screen here. So let's move on to Pro Tour Return to Ravnica, the big show, and talk about modern as a whole and what you need to think about if you're judging an event that includes modern cards. The most popular deck in Modern generally and at Return to Ravnica, Pro Tour Return to Ravnica in particular, was Jund. You may remember this if you're playing Standard a few years ago. Jund is a black-red-green deck, very heavily based on Bloodbraid Elf, and the modern version also relies heavily on Dark Confidant and Tarmogoyf as powerful creatures that will often also be a source of some sort of card advantage, either by giving you cards or forcing the opponent to trade multiple cards in order to get rid of them. It's an aggressive deck. It uses a lot of burn spells as well as planeswalkers and a variety of different creatures to attack in a lot of different ways. And from Return to Ravnica, it has picked up one card that I wanted to highlight in particular, which is Deathrite Shaman. Deathrite Shaman, as a hybrid rare, is a little unusual and has an unusual set of abilities. This guy has tap, exile target land card from a graveyard, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and then can also remove other types of cards from graveyards to make you gain life or your opponent lose life. But it's this first ability that I want to focus on, and that's the ability which he is most commonly used for in the deck. Modern being a fetch land format, it inevitably ends up with quite a lot of land cards in graveyards, and it's these that Deathrite Shaman uses to fuel its kind of Birds of Paradise mode, where it can generate a lot of extra mana and allow the player to cast their key spells earlier. An important thing to know about this card is what he doesn't have there with his first ability is a mana ability. In case you are not familiar with the technical definition of a mana abilities, of course, are those that don't use the stack, which make mana and just happen immediately, don't use the stack and therefore can't be targeted. Mana abilities have to do one of 2 things. They can be activated abilities that just produce mana, such as that most lands have, or they can be triggered abilities that trigger off of mana being produced, don't have targets, and which just produce mana, which is a long way of saying things like Mana Flare that produce extra mana when you tap things for mana. An important sort of sub-rule about mana abilities is that they have to only produce mana and then they have to have no targets. Deathrite Shaman unfortunately breaks both of these things. It exiles a card in the graveyard as part of its effect, and it also targets cards in graveyards. Because of those 2 strikes, it's not a mana ability and it does use the stack. What this means is if the land is exiled in response to the ability, the player won't get the mana. This is particularly relevant in Jund Mirrors, where both players might have a Deathrite Shaman and might be trying to fight for the same resources. One player can try to exile one, the opponent could respond by removing it. Could mean that the result is not what players expect. The other thing to watch out for is with Deathrite Shaman is that technically by the letter of the rules, this means because it's not a mana ability, you can't use it during the process of casting a spell. You would have to use it before casting the spell and to float mana and then cast a spell afterwards. That being said, in most cases, the Magic Tournament rules on out of order sequencing will cover a player who's just basically gone tap 3 lands, tap my Deathrite Shaman, exile something, play a 4-drop. They are, kind of all doing everything in one smooth process. It's all one. The end result is legal. 4 mana is being made for casting cost spell, by which I mean Bloodbraid Elf, because there's always Bloodbraid Elf. Bloodbraid Elf is being cast. Everything's legal there. It's not technically in the right order because they're supposed to stack and resolve the Deathrite Shaman ability first, but we're not going to give a penalty generally for players doing that. If the opponent wanted to respond to that because they have a Relic of Progenitus or a Deathrite Shaman of their own, for example, then we can, of course, just back up the whole thing, put the Bloodbraid Elf back in hand. And that's not a game rule violation backup, that is an MTR kind of backup that is allowed to us to fix these kind of situations where one player is just trying to shortcut things and the other player isn't quite happy with it. We can just back that up and then allow things to progress in the usual, slightly slower way. So that is the shape of Deathrite Shaman. His other 2 abilities work in a similar fashion, although they're not so easy to confuse with mana abilities. They have other effects, and again, they are targeted effects, and the opponent can respond by removing the target in some way. The other thing to mention while we're talking about Jund is another important interaction when judging Modern, which occurs both with this deck and Affinity, which is that of variable power toughness creatures. Tarmogoyf, very widely played in Modern and most commonly found in Jund decks, and Master of Ethereum, found in many Affinity decks, usually in the sideboard, both have variable power and toughness based on some external factor. Something that is important to keep track of when you're watching a Modern match as a judge is thinking about if that variable power and toughness is moving down on something that has already taken some damage. The most common example would be, for example, if a Master of Ethereum attacks, it's blocked by something that's smaller than it, but then some other artifact creatures die in combat as well. Master of Ethereum's power toughness may decrease, and as a result of which it might end up dying. It's most often missed by players when the death happens later in the turn. So, for example, you might see this in limited matches with, or sometimes with creatures with power and toughness equal to the number of cards in their hand. Their 5/5 Maro might be blocked by a 4/4, and then post-combat the player, not really thinking about it, will play a land. So that's another situation to be aware of if you are judging a Modern event, is just keeping a track of variable power toughness coming. Tarmogoyf specifically counts the number of different card types in graveyards in order to determine his power and toughness. His reminder text handily tells you what all the card types are, but that won't stop players from asking. Italics is invisible to most Magic players, and that includes judges, but it is important to remember that reminder text is there, and that it does help with things like this. If you're trying to remember what all the different card types are, then he does have it written on him. The other thing that matters here is how he interacts with burn spells. Because of the way that this works, it's quite hard to kill a Tarmogoyf, a small Tarmogoyf, with something like a Lightning Bolt. This is because if we use Lightning Bolt as an example, Lightning Bolt will deal 3 damage to the Tarmogoyf, but the Tarmogoyf is not actually up for the chop just yet. The Lightning Bolt will go into the graveyard, finish resolving, then state-based actions are checked. And what that means is that the Tarmogoyf will now include that Lightning Bolt as part of its power and toughness calculation, and then it can be the case that will take it past the 4 toughness threshold, and the Lightning Bolt is no longer lethal. Something to watch out for. The example in the standard used to be with Tarfire, which is a tribal instant that dealt 2 damage, could literally never kill a Tarmogoyf because it itself gave a minimum of a 2 toughness pump to the Tarmogoyf and only dealt 2 damage, and therefore it was never going to be enough. Lightning Bolt does more damage and only has 1 card type, and is quite a lot better than Tarfire, and therefore often can kill Tarmogoyfs. But if it's the first instant that's entering the player's combined graveyards, it's something to be aware of. The other thing, of course, is the interaction between Tarmogoyf and Deathrite Shaman, where players may just assume that once a Tarmogoyf hits a size of around 4, 5, 5, 6, he's just kind of going to stay there or will possibly go up. But because of Deathrite Shaman, it is also possible that he's going to go down. So just something to keep an eye on. Some players like to use dice for their Tarmogoyfs, putting a die on a 4 and a die on a 5 on top of the Tarmogoyf. Technically, you could say that, oh, well, that's not allowed because it's not got any +1/+1 counters or anything like that. But really, the player's just trying to make the game a little bit easier for themselves. So I'm not going to say don't do that to a player, but I am going to make sure that they're clear that those dice are a reminder and not the truth, and that it is still their responsibility as the controller of that Tarmogoyf to pay attention to how big their Tarmogoyf is, make sure it dies if it should, make sure it deals the right amount of damage and not too much or too little, and that the dice are just there to kind of help shortcut that process, not to take away any responsibility from the player to, take care of their creature and make sure they know how big it is. So I briefly mentioned affinity there. Other than the Master of Ethereum interaction, there isn't a great deal else on that deck I wanted to touch on, but I would recommend, if you're going to be judging a modern event, that you have a look into how these decks work and what they look like, either by looking at the Pro Tour coverage or Michael Flores' article today. Gives a little kind of breakdown of the top 8 decks, which, as well as being the participants in the top 8 of the Pro Tour, were also fairly representative of the format as a whole. Scapeshift is a pseudo combo deck that you might see. Now, this deck only just became legal again after Valakut became unbanned at the last banned and restricted announcement. And the change here with Scapeshift, the deck works by effectively being a 1-card combo deck that hits 7 or 8 lands in play by using various rampant growth effects, and then casts a Scapeshift. Scapeshift lets you sacrifice any number of lands, then search your library for the same number of lands, put them onto the battlefield. The key interaction with this deck, and pretty much everybody who plays Modern is probably aware of this, but the key interaction works with Scapeshift and Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. The idea is that because the Valakut and the rest of the lands, which are all going to be mountains, are all entering the battlefield at the same time, they all see each other entering at the same time, which means that so long as you're getting at least the requisite 6 mountains, as well as at least 1 Valakut, all of them will trigger the Valakut, and you will get a big stack of Valakut triggers. The bare minimum number of lands it needs is 7 here, in order to get a Valakut and 6 mountains, most of which won't be mountains. They'll be steam vents and so forth, dual land with the mountain type, and that will therefore generate 18 damage worth of triggers, which is basically 20 in most modern matches, because they generally are playing some Ravnica lands and some fetch lands, and will maybe some Dark Confidants, and will have dealt themselves some damage. So that's the way the deck works. It's pretty standard, pretty well known. Only thing to watch out for if you're watching a match as a judge in the case of Scapeshift is making sure that the player is very clearly separating the lands they've sacrificed and the lands they're searching from their library. It's not unusual for them to kind of keep them slightly separate from their graveyard for a moment as a reminder of how many they have, but it is something that's a little bit difficult sometimes, because there's a lot of lands moving around, and sometimes the deck will not be able to win because they don't have enough mountains left in their deck if they've drawn a lot of their lands. And it is therefore tempting for the player maybe to try and slip a land from that stack they sacrificed and kind of bring it into the play as well. So do keep an eye on that kind of funny business. It can happen, and just something to be aware of, really. Right, so that is that deck, and I think that covers all of the decks that I wanted to talk about that aren't the winning deck. So the winning deck from the Pro Tour, and I mean this deck did incredibly well over the weekend. Its pilot Stanislav Sivka went 18-1, and even including if you drop out the draft rounds, went 12-1 with this deck. This deck is called Eggs. Some people call it Second Breakfast. It was originally called Eggs because it's named after Darkwater Egg and the other cycling mana artifacts from Odyssey, which were a part of the deck back in the day. But these days, of course, those are modern legal, and it plays other cards instead, such as Chromatic Star, Chromatic Sphere, Elsewhere Flask, and so forth. I want to dedicate a bit of time to talking about this deck. It is a very complicated, very hard to play combo deck, Most Magic players, even experienced seasoned tournament players, probably can't play it well and can't play it in a timely fashion. Unfortunately, having just seen it win a Pro Tour in the hands of a very capable player who knew very much how the deck worked, it's likely to see a bit of a spike in popularity. The deck is very complex, though, and there's a lot of things to watch out for that I'm going to kind of talk through, and I want to give a really detailed explanation of how this deck works. The deck basically aims to, most of the time, get a Lotus Bloom into play. To do this, it obviously plays and suspends Lotus Blooms, and it also has access to Reshape for 0 in order to search them out of its library. Lotus Bloom isn't essential to the deck, but it is very close to, and is a very powerful tool in it. It also plays a large number of cantripping cheap artifacts. Chromatic Star and Chromatic Sphere, Elsewhere Flask are the kind of bread and butter of this deck that allows it to continue going off. And then Conjurer's Bauble, which also serves a double purpose to recycle the deck. On the big turn, the turn where the deck is attempting to win, it will draw as many cards as it can with these, generating some mana along the way, and then cast either a Faith Reward or a Second Sunrise in order to return everything from their graveyard that went there this turn to the battlefield. It's worth being careful with Second Sunrise and Faith Reward. These cards do work slightly differently. Faith Reward only returns cards from your graveyard, whereas Second Sunrise operates on both players, which if they have something like a Curse Catcher can be very relevant, so it is something to be aware of. Once all those cards are back in play, they then draw a bunch more cards, make a bunch more mana, and then look to, in those cards they've drawn, get another Second Sunrise, another Faith Reward, and go round again. The Conjurer's Baubles in the deck allow it to continually put the Second Sunrise and the Faith Rewards that they've already cast back into the deck, and then eventually to build up a critical mass where they can go through their whole deck as many times, and then win somehow. The popular win conditions include Disciple of the Vault, Grape Shot, and Pyrite Spellbomb. With Pyrite Spellbomb, they will often just play one and just shock 2 at a time, doing 2 damage on each rotation until eventually the recursion burns the opponent out completely. So that's how the deck works. Let's talk about how the deck doesn't work and how players can make mistakes with this deck. First of all, it's very important when watching one of these decks, if you're kind of keeping track, that the player is being careful about which cards went into his graveyard this turn. A key interaction, for example, is that the deck often uses Ghost Quarter to destroy its own lands, so that those lands will then return to the battlefield untapped and be able to make more mana. But it's important that if any of their lands have been destroyed earlier on in the game, or if any of their cheap cycling mana artifacts have been played already, that those aren't returned as part of the Faith Reward, because it will, or a Second Sunrise, both of which only affect things that went into the graveyard during this turn. It's very important that they keep that separate. I would fully endorse players literally having 2 graveyards, kind of a this turn graveyard and an earlier turn's graveyard, to make sure that nothing is accidentally returned, particularly as Conjurer's Bauble might be moving things that were once in one graveyard into the deck and then out again. It's important to make that distinction. Another common error here is making sure that they keep proper track of mana and storm count. Because the decks will usually sideboard between 2 win conditions as a way of increasing resilience against slaughter games, they may swap between 2. Sometimes they'll need storm and sometimes they won't, but so as not to give the game away, they will usually be keeping a storm count anyway, as well as a mana count. All of that needs to be done carefully and accurately. Make sure that that nothing is missed, because these aren't the kinds of errors which players can make and not they need to be kept track of. In particular, when the deck is going off, it's not unusual to see the opponent volunteer to help out, which is a great and very generous thing to do. But you have to remember, even if the victim of the eggs deck is the one that's keeping track of things like a storm count or helping update dice or a written record of how much mana the player has in their mana pool, they are not responsible for it. If they make a mistake with the mana or the storm count, it is actually still the eggs player's responsibility to notice that and to fix it and to make decisions based on it, because it is still their deck. If their opponent is helping them, that's great, but it doesn't become their opponent's responsibility if a mistake is made, unless, of course, you believe that the opponent is intentionally doing something to throw off, such as deducting extra mana here and there to try and stop their opponent comboing off. If you think that is happening, it's time to speak to your head judge, because then they're basically in a situation where they're trying to commit fraud. So something to be very aware of there. The other and probably most important thing about this deck is slow play. And many combo decks in many formats suffer from slow play issues, few more than this one. Second Breakfast is a very complicated deck that has a lot of interactions and a lot of actions that need to be taken in order to progress it to the point of victory. It is a deck that most players, if they pick it up and haven't practiced extensively with it, will not be able to follow everything, will not be able to understand all of their options. Therefore, it is difficult for them to sometimes play within the kind of general feasible, reasonable limits that we expect. I want to be clear here. Saying things like, well, I'm either going to win the game or lose the game this turn is not acceptable. Just saying, oh, well, this is a big turn and lots of stuff is happening, therefore I don't have to play reasonably, is not cool. Each of those decisions incrementally changes the game state. Each of the things that happens little by little. The player is expected to be able to keep track of those things, and if they aren't capable of keeping track of them, then that is their problem and an argument against them choosing to play that kind of deck. Therefore, it is something that is something they have to be kept on track of. They don't need to play fast. That's I don't want to make this kind of false slow play fast play comparison. That's not the issue here. There's kind of slow play, a big gulf of acceptable speed play, and then there's fast play. We're just talking about progressing the game, moving things forward, keeping actions happening, and trying to bring the game forward to a different state. If somebody kind of gets really stuck in this kind of analysis paralysis where they just can't figure out what they're supposed to be doing and they don't know whether they should cast their second sunrise or maybe cast something else first or move things around, give them a little time, give them a caution, say something like, I need you to continue playing the game or something like this, and let them continue along those paths. If it becomes excessive, then consider that a slow play warning might help them be reminded that they do have that kind of a responsibility to the match to keep it moving. I can see we just had a question from Tom. So, hi Tom. He's asked, I guess it's not legal to lie about what they have in mana pool or storm count. You're quite right. These pieces of information, the storm count is derived information, and the amount of mana in mana pool, I believe, is public information. In either case, with either type of information, it is not legal to lie about or mislead somebody about those facts. With something like the storm count, because that's derived information that's based on previous actions taken in the game, the player that doesn't have a responsibility to say what it is. But they do have to explain things about the previous game, such as which spells they've cast this turn. And if they choose to make a statement about storm count, how many spells have been cast so far, they can't lie. They might make a mistake, and we allow mistakes. Yes, as Tom said here, it's all right to say, I don't know, but if the opponent says, which spells have you cast this turn, you then have to say, well, I cast this spell A, B, C, D, E, F, and then they have to say, oh, well, that's 6 spells, so the storm count is 6. They have to have some. They can't lie about previous actions during the game, and previous actions during the game is actually free information. They have to be able to. They have to answer kind of requests about free information as accurately and as fully as they can. But actually lying about things, derived information from things like the storm count, which isn't free information but which is derived from it, hence the name, you can't lie about, and you have to answer accurately as far as you can. So, second breakfast, as I said, it's a very complex deck. There's only, however, one rules interaction that I really wanted to highlight here. One of the more common cards that the deck plays as part of its engine is Elsewhere Flask. A little artifact that makes it, you draw a card when it enters the battlefield, and then also you can sacrifice it to make each land you control the land type of your choice. An important reminder about how land type overwriting works, and this is a format with Blood Moon, so this can also come out. Land type overwriting does actually overwrite the land's existing types. It doesn't add a land type like Prismatic Omen does. It overwrites it, and what that means is the card will lose its other abilities and just become a land of the type you choose. So something to watch out for here, and something a lot of players will forget, is that if they've sacrificed an Elsewhere Flask at some point for, say, islands, their lands are islands and just islands, and they can't tap them for other colours of mana. And whilst going off, of course, in order to make the deck work, they do need to sacrifice their Elsewhere Flasks at some point, so they're in the graveyard so that they can then come back with a second sunrise. So the players will have to do this, and it's important that they remember to do this, choose relevant land types, and then not tap lands for other types of mana later on in the turn. So Tom also asked again here that it removes their ability to Ghost Quarter themselves. That's true, because they Ghost Quarter their own lands a lot. Ghost Quarter, if it has been made into a land type by Elsewhere Flask, will lose that ability. The correct way of doing it is to Ghost Quarter as many of your lands as possible, and only then, at the very last second, before casting your second Sunrise effect, then you sacrifice your flasks. That's the correct way of doing it, but you can't expect that all players will know this. I think that's everything I want to talk about this deck in particular. But I did want to talk about a little bit of the more general things to do with combo decks and address something that's been discussed a little bit in the community lately about slow play in combo decks generally. Real life Magic isn't Magic Online, something I think hopefully we're all aware of, but in particular we don't use, can't use, and will not use chess clocks. We are in a situation, therefore, where it is not unusual for a combo player to take up substantially more than half of the time in a round, and to an extent that's acceptable because we know that that's the kind of deck they're playing, so long as they are advancing the game state and moving things forward. What's not acceptable is just to move elements around and not just kind of never really get anywhere. And what I'm particularly addressing here is the Legacy deck Four Horsemen. Legacy Four Horsemen is another complex combo deck that relies on the interaction of a couple of different cards. One of which is based on Monolith, which can tap for 3 colorless, and you can pay 3 colors to untap it, and it doesn't untap otherwise. And Mesmeric Orb, which whenever a permanent untaps, mills its owner for 1, its controller for 1. The interaction here is obviously the fact that you can continually tap and untap based on Monolith in order to mill yourself a lot. The deck uses Emrakul the Aeon's Torn as a way of making sure it doesn't deck before finding the cards it needs to win. Its primary win condition revolves around getting 4 Narcomoebas. The soft version of the deck combo will just keep involving keeping going until it hits all 4 Narcomoebas before an Emrakul. Of course, you can't allow the Narcomoebas to come in one by one because they will be vulnerable to removal. So the deck will just keep going until eventually it will hit 4 Narcomoebas before it hits the Emrakul, then use usually something like a Dread Return on a reanimation target in order to win. The problem is that the foolproof hard version of the combo also involves hitting a lot of other things in a specific order and not hitting Emrakuls and responding to your own triggers a lot and so on and so forth. And this version of the combo is not something that currently the rules allow you to play in a tournament in the way that you might expect. The problem here is that unlike many combo decks which have some sort of infinite loop that they can recur, the outcome of this combo isn't known. In, for example, an infinite mana combo, they will often be able to say, right, I can demonstrate this set of 6 steps that adds 1 mana to my mana pool and then otherwise resets everything on the board. I can just repeat this loop using the loop rules within the comprehensive rules a million times to have a million mana. That's fine. The problem with this milling thing is because you don't know exactly what you're going to mill at any particular point or in what order, you can't define a clear loop in that fashion, and therefore you can't shortcut your combo in the same way. And Four Horsemen in particular, because it can spend a very large amount of time milling itself, but an indeterminate amount of time where the player can't just tell you, I'm going to mill myself this many times, isn't actually currently allowed by the looping rules, and therefore will often run afoul of slow play. I just wanted this to be something really that you as a listener are aware of, because it's, as I say, in Legacy only, and it's not a very played deck, but it is something that I think is a really good discussion topic when thinking about slow play, and when you really want to kind of understand the problems with combo decks. Try comparing how that deck compares with something like High Tide in Legacy, a deck which superficially is actually quite similar to Eggs because it, again, relies on playing a lot of spells, drawing a lot of cards, and generating a lot of mana. Then it's that kind of sort of moving pieces combo deck, and how it compares with a sort of more traditional infinite combo deck, such as Kiki Jiki and Restoration Angel or other untap effects, which is also played in Modern. So that's kind of the open discussion topic for this week, which is talking about things and in terms of combo decks. So talking more specifically about Pro Tour Return to Ravnica, there were two judging situations during the tournament that I wanted to address. Um, let's talk about the shorter topic first. During the quarterfinals between Li Jian and Eduardo Sergalik, there was a situation which occurred right at the very end of Game 5, which was a little bit awkward for everybody involved. There were two basic things that happened very close to each other at the very end of the game. Effectively, what happened was that Eduardo cast a Vendilion Click. His opponent tried to cryptic command it. Eduardo responded with a counterspell of his own, and then the opponent cast a second cryptic command, and there was basically a counter war over this spell. Eventually, in fact, what happened is that the Vendilion Click actually resolved, and Eduardo didn't use the triggered ability of Vendilion Click. If you've been watching the show for a little while, you'll know from the triggered abilities presentation that we did a few weeks ago that that's a-okay. If he doesn't remember his own triggers, then that's his fault and not something his opponent has to remind him about, and not something that we penalise or fix. And it just simply didn't happen. Unfortunately for him, had he seen his opponent's hand, he could have taken a game-ending scapeshift away from it and potentially shifted the outcome of the match. However, during the opponent's next turn, the game was stopped by the judges for a discussion. What they were discussing was whether or not he had had the 6 blue mana available amongst his 8 lands to cast 2 cryptic commands in the previous turn, which he had in fact done. The problem here is that the rules don't, the current tournament rules don't allow them to look over the video coverage to check his lands, and they wanted to be sure that he had had the correct mana to cast those at the right time. This was a situation where they were trying to get all of the mana right. They weren't sure because there were a lot of different lands and mana producing abilities whether he had tapped the lands correctly or not. The judges spent some time investigating this, looking at the lands on the battlefield, trying to figure out what had been tapped where, and also, of course, trying to make sure that they did as much of this investigation as possible without tipping off the players as to what was going on. And the reason was because they didn't want the cryptic commanding scapeshift player to be able to cover if he had made a mistake by lying or by being unclear. So they spent as much time asking questions as without being specific and trying to check, what lands did you tap, where and when. As it happens, we, as outside observers, can review the video coverage and see that, in fact, there was 6 blue mana available. He did tap it correctly because he had a flooded grove, which he could use to filter green into blue-blue, and therefore get exactly the right mana out of his lands in order to do it. But the point here really is about careful investigating, careful discussion with players, and making sure that you're right before you allow the game to continue. So that's something that that I wanted to draw attention to. The second thing I wanted to draw attention to from this is a disqualification. Now, first of all, I want to make very, very clear the normal situation with all disqualifications is that whilst that DQ is made, we do not discuss disqualifications as a general rule. We don't just go over the details of them, and particularly while the investigations committee is deciding whether or not to suspend somebody, we don't discuss them because it can sort of prejudice the outcome of that, or it can lead to a player having reputational damage that they don't deserve if it turns out that they were just making an innocent mistake. That being said, this particular case, the disqualification of Jackie Lee, is actually something we are all right to discuss because all of the basically involved participants have allowed it to be public. Jackie Lee has written an article about her disqualification, talking about it, and Toby Elliott, who was at the Proton involved, although not the head judge, was involved in this ruling, has also made a post about it. Therefore, in this case, we can discuss it, and I just wanted to make sure that it's clear that generally we wouldn't. That being said, Jackie Lee's article, it's on tcgplayer.com, about the disqualification is required reading as far as I'm concerned. For all serious judges, it is an excellent, excellent article talking about both what she did, her opponent did, what the judges did, and is very fair and balanced in the culpability of each of those parties. Effectively, no one of those parties was entirely at fault or entirely innocent of fault. There were some decisions and mistakes made by everybody involved that led to the situation, but of course the key issue landed on Jackie. Just to summarise the situation for you, and I don't want to take away from the excellence of her article, or indeed of Toby Elliott's blog post explaining his position on it, The key thing that happened was that Jackie had noticed her opponent in a draft round writing down a life total from change from stab wound, but not otherwise acknowledging or announcing that life total change. And due to a misunderstanding of the triggered ability rules, thought that therefore she didn't have to say anything and that it was their fault for not saying anything and that they weren't going to actually make her lose 2 life in this fashion. Of course, that is acknowledgement of the trigger in some regard, and was made at the right time. In fact, what Jackie was doing here was noticing that her opponent had a life total discrepancy, and that her own life version of events had her at a higher life total. She knew about that. She knew that the life totals were different, and she didn't call a judge. And that is the definition of one of the examples of fraud, is not calling an error to light as soon as you're aware of it. She's been extremely good about it, and I think everybody's been very impressed with the handling of the situation, both from Jason LeMahieu and the other judges who were involved, and Jason being the level 5 who was the head judge of the Pro Tour, and especially on the part of Jackie, who has not been sort of finger pointing, etc. So all I really want to say about that is please go read the article if you haven't already. Read through the comments as well. Read Toby Elliott's blog post about it. But if you do nothing else, if you take nothing else away from this, it's read that article because it's got some really good points and argues itself extremely clearly. So that's what I would say as a real key point from this one. So that's all of the things I wanted to talk about in this whistle-stop tour of Modern. I can say honestly, if you are sort of kind of people, if you have Friday Night Magic or other kind of casual Magic events at your local store that you're involved in, running an occasional Modern tournament is a great idea because it lets older players crack out their older cards and newer players experience things which maybe were a little before their time. And I think you'll find that people will enjoy it. It's an incredibly diverse and healthy, lively format. Remember, there are a few bannings, and if you are running it at a casual level, that might be something that some of your less experienced players, less competitive players aren't familiar with. But remind them that there is a short banned list of cards. Put it up somewhere in your store or playing area to remind them of what they've got access to. And just generally keep a track of it because it's a great format. I also wanted to let you know what we're going to be doing next week. You will remember from the start of the stream I said, of course, the clocks are changing here in England this weekend, but at Greenwich Mean Time, 7 p.m. on next Thursday, we're going to be talking about combat. And the reason is that hopefully at some point around then, I'm also going to be a guest on JudgeCast North, which is hosted by Charlotte Sable and Chris Lansdell. Those two guys have very kindly agreed to have me on. They're also going to be talking about combat. So if you haven't checked out their podcast before, JudgeCast North, then do so. Otherwise, have a very good week. Enjoy your weekend. If you're going to Ravnica, return to Ravnica game day this weekend, have fun with that. And I hope to see you all next week. Have a very good evening and goodbye.